This is a podcast discussion. So it's a discussion about a podcast episode in the Talkcast series by Brad Hall. Shout out to Brad Hall. The title of his podcast is In Praise of Ignorance. And I want to comment on this because I thought it's a really interesting thought that I got inspired by this conversation that he had with a lady. She's an education expert. And they spoke about the concept of compulsory education. In other words, the school system that we all know across the world, almost everywhere, and that we actually even associate with civilization. And that compulsory school system, while it has certain advantages, has a lot of disadvantages. And I think we can probably summarize them in three buckets. One is opportunity cost. One is compulsory education can also morph very quickly into propaganda and state-controlled thought, so Orwellian kind of situation. And then third, and I think that's the most important factor as far as I'm concerned, is that there is some sort of bitter lesson to be learned for humanity. What I mean by that is the concept of the bitter lesson, which is the Richard Sutton essay about AI and how we should train AI, actually applies to humanity also. Humans are just biological neural nets. So what applies to artificial neural nets actually can be transferred to biological neural nets. And that is that we don't want to have explicit knowledge programmed into our brains. We don't want to have actually preset plan of what we're supposed to learn. What we want to have is diversity and generality and scale. I'm going to discuss this in more detail, what that actually means for humans and how I think this idea of ignorance and anti-compulsory education, or as David Deutsch says, take children seriously, this concept, in fact, is very similar to the bitter lesson in AI. This is not even on podcast. It's July 22nd, 2025. This is Krim Delco. For the year, we're down 11%. The market is up 7%. We're underperforming by 18%. Brett Hall has this conversation with Liberty. The lady's name is Liberty, which I find pretty interesting given the topic. And they talk about the compulsory education. And Brett Hall is a Deutschian, so he's making a case against compulsory education. So let me first explain what compulsory education actually means, and then what David Deutsch's arguments are against it, and in general, also that's what Brad Hall is thinking, and then let me talk about the connotation with the bitter lesson, which I think is really interesting. So first, okay, what is compulsory education? Compulsory education is basically state-controlled curriculum, the K to 12 schooling system. In many countries, actually, it starts even earlier. 2-3-year-old kids go to kindergarten. There are curricula that decide what they're supposed to learn. And then once we go to kindergarten and first grade up to 12th or 13th grade, depending on the country, it's pretty structured. So if you live in Germany, France, US, California, New York, Canada, even China, Cambodia, whatever, Singapore, chances are you're going to face very similar learnings. And that, just to give a little bit of history, this system actually is not that old. It started in the mid-19th century. I think it started in Germany and France. With the rise of the nation state, the leaders back then, whether it was Bismarck or Napoleon and all these types of leaders, they figured that they need a strong nation and they wanted to educate their people. I am just reading Anna Karenina now, Tolstoy's novel, which was written in the mid-19th century, and there's a lot of conversation, let's say, between Levin and some of his friends and I think also relatives in the countryside about should we educate our peasants? What's the point of that? Things along those lines. That was the big conversation in the 19th century, and it won. And I think a lot of people would probably today sit down and with a straight face say this was a success. If we look at, let's say, people coming out of poverty, if we look at women's education, actually, if we flip this around and we just ask ourselves, well, if you're against compulsory education, so if you don't give somebody an education then they're going to end up on the street. So clearly, compulsory education is a very good thing. Now, David Deutsch, of course, is a little bit smarter than that, and he's not just falling into this trap, because that is, of course, a futile argument. This is kind of like saying, well, we can't free slaves because they have never been taught how to live in freedom. So if we free them now, then they will not know how to live, or something like that. I mean, it's totally stupid. The fact that we have compulsory education means that if you don't get it, then of course you're an outcast in society. You don't have a chance in this cultural, societal, economic system that we live in, where if you don't have a degree, high school degree, college degree, and so on and so forth, you can't even get a job. So your chances to succeed are very small. Of course, there are college dropouts and people like that who make billions with as entrepreneurs, but clearly those are very few. And the point that Deutsch and also Brett Hall are making is, in principle, a compulsory education is a bad thing for a couple of reasons. And now let's define what compulsory education actually means. It means there is a fixed curriculum for everybody. And even Sal Khan, the founder of Khan Academy, has said that many, many times, that what they've learned in Khan Academy is that if people can learn at different paces, they learn better. Because some people are faster at capturing math, other people are faster at reading English literature, other people are faster at understanding concepts in history than others, and those people progress faster in history, but then maybe slower in math. But if you give people that flexibility, then they actually end up in a better place, all of them. Now, this still implies that there is a certain curriculum that is dictated by the state, which David Deutsch also questions. And the reason he questions that is that he's Popperian in the sense that there is no such thing as ability, there's only interest. And if you're not interested in math, then no matter how much time you take, no matter how many tutors you take, you will never be very good at math, but maybe you'll be very good at something else. And there's a certain cultural hierarchy in our society. Brett Hall talks about this, where the smartest people are math people, and then physics, and then science, and then social science, and then arts, and then sports. And this hierarchy, of course, is unfair on the one hand, but more importantly also, it's not very productive, because you can have a situation where somebody maybe is really, really good at, let's say, animation or design, like John Lasseter. He created Pixar. And why should John Lasseter spend time learning differential equations when he is incredibly creative with Pixar? Why should a theoretical physicist who is really good at math and understands the mathematics of black holes spend time drawing or learning history when he's not interested? So my point here is, and I mean David's point and Brett Hall's point, is that there is really an inclination, an interest, and we should foster that interest in people and not force them to study a fixed curriculum. The concept of opportunity cost is an economic concept, which basically means if I do one thing, then I cannot do another thing, and therefore there's a cost. Anything I do costs me at least everything else I cannot do. In other words, even if something is free, there's no free lunch. I mean, economists always say that. If I go on a hike tomorrow, then that means that I cannot work, that I cannot spend time with my friends, or that I can't sleep. So because I'm hiking. So there's always an opportunity cost. And of course, with learning, if I spend 8 hours learning math, those are 8 hours that I could have spent doing something else. So there's opportunity cost. Then there's the risk of state-controlled, top-down propaganda. We have the woke movement in the US right now, which is very dangerous. We have socialism in Europe also, which is state-controlled and also fed through the schools. Things like changing history in favor of certain, racial or gender agendas and things like that. Very dangerous stuff. The communists tried it in the Soviet Union. It went very bad. It ended up in the Gulag. So I think we should be very careful. And of course, David, as a I would say very free, he's a free spirit as a person. Will certainly not condone a system that allows for top-down centralist dictatorship like or doctrine within the education system. And I think that's a topic on itself that we have to take very seriously. I think the education departments at universities are the sort of the Trojan horse for left-wing socialism, wokeism, and all these really bad influences in the United States. I was asked recently whether I think the McCarthy era was a bad time in the United States, and my conclusion is it wasn't bad enough, because we weren't able to eradicate the virus that actually now is biting us in the ass. Excuse my French. Because now we have this communism and socialism and wokeism and all these isms in our universities, which are really, really dangerous and could have gone much, much worse if it hadn't been for this political swing back to Trump and the Republicans in power. But again, the virus is still there, and I don't think the United States is out of the woods. But anyway, that warrants its own episode, I think. But the point, again, that Brad is making and David Deutsch is less political. It's more about actually learning and the value of learning and the ability to really get the potential out of everybody. Now, I want to add my own idea here, and that is the bitter lesson applied to humanity. What I mean with that is that compulsory education is kind of a little bit like explicit learning in artificial intelligence, or symbolic systems learning, or all these like pre-transformer, or no, even pre-neural net type approaches towards intelligence. So we hard code knowledge, we determine what knowledge is and things like that. We determine what is a cat, we determine what is a good poem, what is a bad poem, versus we do it sort of the attention is all you need type approach, or even broader, the bitter lesson approach, which is let's just have a very general, large model trained on massive amounts of compute with lots of diverse data, and we will then extract intelligence from that model, and that will be implicit. So we can't explicitly define what is a good poem. We can't explicitly define what is good driving. We just have to train on a lot of data, and then it will sort of emerge. And I think the same applies to humans. And what that means is that if we take humanity, we have 8 billion people. If we let them diversify their knowledge acquisition as much as we can, if we also let them, of course, we need to give them compute, which or energy. In other words, of course, people have to have the means to actually learn. So we need to bring people at least out of a certain poverty level that allows them to function. But then we should let people actually, just pursue their own interest. And as a collective humanity, we would have a much, much higher level of intelligence. To use Elon Musk's words, we would get much closer to Kardashev 1 level of where we can, harness the whole energy of our sun, because we would have enough intelligence and more intelligence than we have now. In other words, the compulsory education system that we're exposed to right now is actually really making it more difficult for us as a humanity to progress. And in concrete terms, that also shows in something like hiring. Okay, if you're a company like Tesla, Nvidia, Anduril, Valar Atomics, and all these other interesting, innovative new startups in the energy space, this is a space that we know very well. You are exposed to the same kind of hire almost across the world, right? And yes, there is personalities, there is the quirky, maybe a weird person here and there that might add a lot more value than the average. But overall, as a company, you really are exposed to a pretty standard set of quality and knowledge acquisition, let's say in the undergrad, even grad level. And that is not such a good thing, right? Imagine a world where we actually take children seriously, we use a bitter lesson approach to education, so everybody kind of follows their own interest, and we have a much more diversified body of knowledge embedded in humanity. And then you could hire from that pool of knowledge, which would be much, much more diverse, much, much more creative, and in my opinion, also yield much, much faster results. Now, the sort of well, the home run here, of course, is if we combine the bitter lesson in AI with the bitter lesson in humanity. So if we apply a more liberal education, liberal in a sense, not in an American left-wing sense, but in a sense that in a David Deutschian take children seriously type of way, if we combine that with the actual bitter lesson, which is large compute and general models, we could have much faster progress in science, and therefore much faster progress in engineering and company creation and wealth creation. So to summarize, I think this essay that was discussed in the Brett Hall podcast with the title "In Praise of Ignorance" really made me think about the value of compulsory education and the risks of it, more risks than value. But more importantly, I see a parallel here between the bitter lesson in AI and the bitter lesson in the biological neural nets, which is human intelligence. And I think both apply. So large, diverse, general models, less explicit or less compulsory education, and more free exploration, diverse exploration, follow your own interest type education would yield much, much faster progress and yield more intelligence and more useful intelligence, as defined as intelligence that is more applicable towards progress and wealth creation. Thank you.